My name is Pat Brodowski. I'm the vegetable gardener at Monticello. And at Monticello, we have a gardener for each of the gardens, one for vegetables, one for fruit, one for flowers, and one for native plants. So you can see what I garden on is a terrace. It's 1,000 feet long. It's like 3 football fields end to end. And my goal is to plant everything that Jefferson grew. So I have a list based on this book. Our former director, Peter Hatch, before he retired, he published a book about the garden called A Rich Spot of Earth. It details the restoration process that the garden went through and all the plants in it. And in the back is a list of all the plants. And so on my list, what I work from is this. There's 382 plants here. And he designed the garden as 24 squares on this 1,000-foot terrace and a border. So within that, we plant rows of the produce to actually kind of be decorative. At one point, I tried to grow his 1813 planting plan like last year, but some of his ideas were not conducive to saving seeds or for appropriate plant. Like he had okra planted around the tomatoes, so one shaded the other out. And so we'll never do that again. And then we put sesame seeds around the carrots, and that was interesting, except one was tall, one was short, and so it was confusing. So
how wide are those beds?
Basically 42 feet deep and about 35 feet this way, and there's little grass paths between. He grew all kinds of interesting plants. Generally, in the era that Jefferson lived from the late 1700s to 1826 when he died, those pre-colonial, post-colonial plants were all based on European northern plants, the things like beets and lettuces, and those things survive in that cold northern European climate. What was neat about Jefferson is that he was growing things that survive in hot climates. In Virginia, in July, generally the temperature's around 100 degrees, and so we have to irrigate, and although he could not, so he was taking things that his enslaved workers were growing successfully, like the eggplant and the melons and gherkins and okra and that kind of thing. And so his whole garden philosophy was an experimental patch. The whole thing was so he could try out new crops and see what would be successful in Virginia. And that's the sesame is right here. I hope I can, right there, coming up. And so he was growing sesame to make oil, sesame oil for salad. He had a taste test in the White House between olive oil and sesame oil. He was trying to grow olive trees, did that unsuccessfully. He tried to grow the sesame seeds, press oil out. That wasn't really successful either. He was hoping it would be a great economic crop. Pressing the oil out was something they didn't have the technology to do. He tried wooden presses, and the presses broke. He tried iron presses, and it left a color in the oil. And so then, finally, by the end of his life, someone said, well, try, I think it's sweet gum wood. It's even more dense than the woods you've been using. And at 1 year, he got 1 gallon of oil. So he just said, like one failure leads to the success of another, something like that. In his lifetime, he grew all kinds of food crops experimentally, and he planted them all at the same time. So in 1774, he's growing 7 different kinds of pumpkin side by side. So then that gives me a nice detective work. What does he mean by some of these pumpkins? So Zucca de Pescatori, that's a Marina di Chioggia squash. It's the one from the ocean, from the fishermen. It means pumpkin of the seaside or the fishing community. And so that's still available. And then the Zucchi Bianchi, I have to pardon my Italian, I'm not very good at this, but I'm thinking it's the white bower pumpkin. I'm trying to get some kind of approximation to what he might have meant. The Boers apparently settled in South Africa in the 1600s and had fantastic vegetable gardens. And Jefferson, of course, on the trade routes, he knew these people most likely, and maybe he had that pumpkin. So it's kind of a connection. So, and then there's still white pumpkins and black pumpkins, and I haven't seen a black pumpkin anywhere. I keep looking and looking. So every time the seed catalogs come out, I read through trying to see, is it there? Is this black pumpkin there? So, and then he has the sweet potato pumpkin was very popular, and they did all kinds of cooking ideas with that, with stuffing it and with frying it and everything else. So his list during his lifetime grew to like over 380. I have 382 on this list, and then I just got a letter last night with some more things, including avocados and some kind of corn from Mexico. So I got a whole new list. I think of 20 more things to add to the list. So you can see it's like lots and lots of things. 12 cantaloupes, 29 different cabbages. Then he has peanuts and secale and you name it, if he could get his hands on it, he tried it. And even the last year of his life, he's writing to Ohio to find this super long serpent cucumber or snake melon. And so what does he mean by that? So we're growing snake gourds and we're growing the serpent cucumbers, and we're trying to compare notes to what he was describing. And then we continue, we try to grow his plants, and then we try to interpret all these plants. You know, every plant has a great story. And then we have, in our education program, we have interpreters from Williamsburg come and actually cook from the garden up off on the fire. And here's some children learning how to make a dish, I think, with beans or cabbage. And then we have summer camps. Everyone wants to know what happens to the vegetables. We do have summer camp. The kids all come and harvest things. It's really an excitement for them. And all our elementary school children in Charlottesville, they all have gardens at their schools. And they come through our garden too, and they do a huge journaling project with weather, with plants, with cultural information. This is a little scale of water bottles to compare how much weight one beet might have, and then they have an authentic scale. They can see if that estimation is correct. So each bottle has a few ounces in it. And then we have a lot of media people that come to make movies of the garden, because it is pretty nice. And in the Hearth Kitchen, we have different cooks that come and cook with our vegetables. And this is P. Allen Smith's crew that made a few videos. Walter Stabe, if you know the City Tavern in Philadelphia, he came and made 3 segments of his TV show, Taste of History, using vegetables and cooking in the garden, cooking from the garden in July. And it was an amazing feat. And then, of course, we all got to eat it, which is delicious. So having the Jefferson Garden kitchen restored is really a great thing. They put in the stew stoves, and they have the rotisserie and all the ancient, the 1700s cooking equipment, and it all works. So then we also have tasting tours twice a week. To celebrate the book that Peter put out, we decided to launch a tour in which we explained the kind of revolutionary ideas Jefferson had, that you could keep trying things, that you have all these new plants that you could try and grow successfully. And so part of that was to taste things, and we at one point we were cooking things, and so we had a squash taste-off. We had 4 different squashes and 4 different herbal or seasonings on them, and just compare notes. Here's an image of the garden, in case you're thinking about the squares. 24 squares are numbered from one end to the other. Jefferson used a Roman numeral system for that, and then each row was listed with an Arabic numeral. So he kept extensive journals, and so we really do know what he was growing in each place. And here I'm trying to interest some kids in eating kales. We grew kales side by side so they could see the different foliage and taste, and get excited about that. Also, besides the seeds that Jefferson was getting from seed companies or friends, the Lewis and Clark expedition was sent out west, and they brought back a number of seeds. So this year, we were really excited to receive seeds from descendants of the tribes that they visited at Fort Mandan. And so we got seeds from the Hidatsa, the Arikara, and the Mandan Indians, and we planted them this year. We had visitors plant them as they came to the garden. And we have the red clay corn there on the right. I was really surprised to see the corn is only this tall. All the other varieties of corn we grow like 12 feet tall. So that's really cool. And the Hidatsa beans are already ready to harvest. They're very short season crops. And the corn would be really cool in a flower pot, I think. And so for our fall harvest, we're going to have to replant them because they're going to be all gone by fall harvest. So it's like we'll have 2 seasons. Generally, we plant only not in December. We plant every other month of the year. So there's some sources we have for the seeds. We do a lot of purchasing of seeds. We do a lot of saving seeds. I save everything that we can save just because I want to have that regional aspect to it. It seems like if I save seeds and plant it, it'll grow better for me than if we start off with a package from the company, because wherever they've been growing, they're not acclimated to Virginia. So we access seeds from all of these places. Here's Peter Hatch. He's the guy who started restoring the garden like 36 years ago. And so the way to restore a garden like this, you have to go through all of the documents that we have, which we do have a lot. Jefferson wrote 19,000 letters in his lifetime, and we're still finding little bits and pieces like I got yesterday. And then he has his own garden library, so I tried to read all the books that Jefferson read, Cato and Varro and Philip Miller and all these people. And then the other garden books from his era that maybe the information was out there that people shared. And then seed catalogs, of course, and then plant histories that people have developed. And then I studied Philip Mazzei, who was his buddy. Philip Mazzei was an Italian entrepreneur and agriculturist and came to Monticello to start vineyards and also helped start his garden. So Jefferson's early journals are in Italian. That's why all the pumpkins were named in Italian. And so we also grow the seed that he grew, and he saved the seeds, and we use techniques. And of course, we have pest control. Jefferson didn't have a number of pests that we have. We have at least 24 more things to deal with than Jefferson did. And then we also use archaeology. So here's a picture of what Jefferson's journal looked like, and now it's been annotated and published since the 1940s. And if you want to look at the original, you can look at it through the Massachusetts Historic Society. So that's interesting to look back and see, you know, you can search it, you can actually get a sense of what maybe he was recording. He does record what he's doing, and he never tells us why he's doing it or what he's going to do with it. So that's something. So that's why we have to read all of these other books. So here's a picture of the Gardener's Dictionary from Philip Miller. He was the gardener at Chelsea Physic Garden in London. All the apothecaries wanted to know what the plants really look like, so they decided to grow a garden of them so that people could actually handle them. Because if you remember the woodcuts from his time frame, woodcuts pictures have to fit on the block, and so you might have your plant curling up, but it doesn't grow that way. It might be much taller, and things might be exaggerated on a woodcut that aren't really that way in the real life. And then the American Gardener's Calendar by Bernard McMahon was really a book that we can use. It was printed in 1806. McMahon came from Scotland to start a nursery in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was like the center of botanical industry, selling plants to Europe, and the Bartrams lived there and so forth. So in that book, it gives you every plant, every month, what to do, how to grow it. And so all the cultural techniques are there. And so if we can find it in McMahon, most likely Jefferson would have been doing that technique. And in the back is a list of like 1,500 plants. I actually have McMahon's broadside. This is what Jefferson would have ordered his plants from. It's a broadside like this. This is from 1800 and shows you what the names were, for instance, and how they were categorized. So if you look on this under annual flowers, you'll find the eggplant and tomato because it's still an ornamental at that time. So that's pretty amazing. And then all the names for things like brown Dutch lettuce and tennis ball lettuce and things that Jefferson really loved to plant. So then here's some more references for the gardening going on in his time. The Virginia housewife, for instance, someone here was telling me they want to know how to take from the garden and start eating it. And so what we do is we go back to the cookbooks of Jefferson's family and see what were they using things for, like the cymlings or like the sweet potato squash that was being stuffed and baked. Charles Mackintosh's Book of the Garden is the Scottish book from the 1830s, and it does have a great description of vegetables, and I think I'll show you that in a second. And here's online resources, of course. These are 3 things I use. I know here at Seed Savers they have some more databases that I just learned about these with seed catalogs, and you can look at what was being planted. So I do a lot of this sort of detective sleuthing to figure out what to plant. Well, here's about Philip Mazzei. He was from Italy, and although he was establishing the vineyards and he brought 10 more people to help him, he also, I think, influenced the choices of vegetables for Jefferson. And what I've got is a map here, because where Charlottesville, Virginia is, it kind of is the same latitude as where Philip Mazzei came from in Italy. And the elevation is important, so I'm not sure what Philip's elevation might have been, but pretty much the seeds from like central Italy or northern Italy work very well in the climate that we have in Virginia. We do have a really dry, hot place to grow things. The top 3 inches of the soil is usually dry. And so when we plant, we dig it deep and get the roots down into that clay layer. Also, when Jefferson was traveling through France and Italy, he saw a lot of things. He saw, for instance, rice out there. He wanted so bad to bring the rice back from a certain area in Italy. And they said, no, you cannot. This is a regional product. It'll never leave Italy. And he said, can I buy a pound of rice? And they said, okay. And then he put it in his pockets and he got out of the country. And so he was, you know what seed savers are like. Yeah. So then archaeology is something new that happened this year in our garden. It hasn't happened for a long time. We had funding for several projects at Monticello, including restoring the original Mulberry Row and the kitchen road between where the enslaved Hemmings family lived and the kitchen. They're taking out all of the stairways and things that were put in the 1940s. And then meanwhile, they said, well, let's put in a geothermal heating plant for the house, and let's just go through the garden for that. And then before any of that starts, we do archaeology, because every time you put the shovel in the ground and new ground, you'll get artifacts. And so Jefferson was talking about, way long ago, his olatory, which is the word for a kitchen garden. And if you know the botanical word oleracea, that means from the kitchen garden. You know, and like officinalis means from the medicine cabinet. So if you see oleracea, it means it's a kitchen garden plant. So his olatory, up in the picture up on the right, you can see it's in stages, these sort of wall that is in 3 sections. And on each level, each rise of the wall, is a thorny, hedgy thing, like hawthorn or thorny honey locust. And so that's his plan. And actually, it's very interesting because he reduces the beds to 42 feet long, and our beds are 42 feet long. So we're kind of like really accurate there. And so what happened this winter is when they started the archaeology on the bank that was where the pipes were going to go for the geothermal plant, they actually got back to the original garden wall. They can tell by the soil colors. And there it is. The olatory was there with the steps. And then at the bottom was a whole step. You see above his, Devon's knees there is a rock wall. It's actually not faced rocks, but they're stacked. And then we think erosion was happening even in Jefferson's time, and then they had to put those rocks in there to hold the erosion back. So it's eroded this much now. It's a 45-degree angle nowadays. And it was really sweet to have it back, because we've lost like 6 feet of the garden, the border, with this erosion. So that's pretty cool. And then we do a lot of rotation in our garden. Jefferson was into rotation, but not so much in the kitchen garden, but he was in the field. And so this is his rotation plans. You know, they were experimental, I guess. He always had rye and barley. The oats were not very easy to grow there. Buckwheat's really easy to grow, and clover. We no longer plant any barley. But that's interesting that he had a rotation scheme at one point of 7 different plants over 11 years. He was always trying to replenish the soil with manure or with field crops. So here's the buckwheat. He felt buckwheat would equal, a field of buckwheat would equal 10 loads of manure. And the manure he got was from a farm 4 miles away downhill. And so he's also studying how the mules or beasts of burden that had the biggest shoulders that could pull these carts uphill. Because if you know, in Charlottesville, everything's like this, and it's all wiggly roads that go back and forth. So also he might have eaten buckwheat cakes. We don't really know, but somebody felt that was true. Winter rye is something he would grow, and we grow that a lot. And this is very interesting because I was reading about potato beetle, which was a huge issue for us a few years ago. The potato beetles overwinter in your soil, and then when we planted the potatoes, as soon as they sprouted, the beetles would be out there eating them off. So I'd read about winter rye being allelopathic, which means it disperses insects. So we planted the rye in the field. We got it up to almost where it was seeding, cut it back, and tilled it in. And then that year, we had no potato bugs. And Virginia Tech, meanwhile, wanted some bugs from us to breed into their problem areas where they don't have sprays that work any longer. And they came out to collect them, and I said, I don't have any. And so they looked at every leaf, and they found 3 egg masses and a couple of adults, and said, you know, we need 50. Can you just let these mature? It's like, no. So the interesting thing about rye is you can see that straw basket there. It's from the 1800s, early 1800s, late 1700s. All the Pennsylvania German farmers knew to make rye straw baskets to store their grains in, or to make their bread proof in it. And they also made their hats from it, and they thatched their roofs from it because it's insect repellent. And so, I mean, it's a great thing. So we plant a lot of rye. Last winter, we had such deer pressure that all of it got eaten off. So we planted it again and had a small crop about this much. But we're really trying to see if it will work against bean beetles and all those other nasty bugs. So generally, we're kicking back our bug populations with stuff like this, or trap crops. And we do a lot of composting. So it's a traditional thing. It goes back to the Roman times. Of course, Jefferson read Roman treatises on how to garden. So this is my daughter learning the roles of composting. Everything we gather out of the garden gets put in a compost heap, turned over, and reapplied. So here's some plants that Jefferson was growing. And I brought some things that you can look at. This is the Virginia Gourdseed Corn. You can see it makes a really huge ear. And it's got a seed that's flat, and it looks like a gourd seed. Jefferson was talking about a sweet and shriveled corn. So when I was reading through the history of this particular corn, it seemed to match what Jefferson would have had available. So I wish he had said gourdseed corn, but he didn't. So we're growing this as if it's his plant. And then he didn't really have very good corn crops. If you read the details, from 1790 to 1820, he had 3 good corn crops. He didn't have a lot of pests, but the weather was terrible. So he had hail, he had wind, he had flooding. Things would just beat this crop back. And he doesn't mention animal problems, but I bet there was animals eating it too. So this corn actually matures the cobs way up here. So we don't have problems with like raccoons or something. I think maybe they don't see it, but we haven't had that issue yet. The gourd seed corn does look like gourd seeds, and this is a funny story. I went to plant a snake gourd, which are really long. They get about 4 feet long. They may be curled up. We have a whole pile of them, and I went to get one, and what I do is I open them and I put rocks in it and shake it all out to get the seeds shuck out so that we have the gourds to play with the kids. And so I took this gourd and I'm shaking the seeds out, and all of these white seeds come out. And I'm thinking, gosh, this looks like gourd seed corn. I was like, it is gourd seed corn. And it's like a mouse was on the other end and had taken all the gourd seeds out and substituted the gourd seed corn for it. Yeah. You have to know your seeds, you know. And then here's tobacco. We grow tobacco now in our kitchen garden, which is completely wrong, but every visitor wants to know where is the tobacco, where is the cotton. I brought a cotton bowl in case you haven't seen one before. So here's the cotton bowl, and you can come up here and play with it if you want. You can feel the seeds inside the cotton. So Jefferson grew cotton, flax, and hemp for clothing, and he had sheep also. The whole story of sheep is a very funny one, which I'll get into if we have time. White cotton was used generally for a trade, and then the brown cotton, brown linted cotton, was used for clothing. The white is preferable because it takes dye colors really well. So tobacco, we grew tobacco last year, and we let it flower and get tall. And all the local Virginians came by and said, "What are you doing? You have to top that tobacco off. You can only have 9 leaves on a tobacco plant." And I'm thinking, I've never seen this, and I didn't see it on the web either. So I'm reading the tobacco history, and back in the 1600s, 1691, because every farmer and every enslaved person and every person had tobacco growing, there was a big glut on the market. And so the law came out that you could only have 1,000 plants, and you could only have 9 leaves per plant. And so this persists now since 1691. And so the whole idea in Virginia is you have to have these great big elephant ears of tobacco. And so, okay, we topped it off, and then you have to take the suckers off because the plant, of course, wants to bloom. And so, yeah, we're getting the big leaves. And now when they turn mottled, we have to take each one off and carefully preserve it. And so, I'm being educated about how to do it. When we had it grow into flowers, it gets really, really buggy. And so aphids love it. Tobacco hornworms love it. We had so many hornworms, but they had a lot of parasites on them, so that was a good thing because we don't have those parasitic wasps. But it is easier to grow when you have fewer leaves to worry about. So, so far it's working for us. And then, of course, you hang it up in the barn to dry it. Back in Jefferson's day, they put it in hogsheads, which are barrels 5 feet wide, and attach a bar through the middle of this round barrel and pull it down a road called a rolling road. And so I don't know if out west you have rolling roads or not, but in Baltimore there's rolling road, and in every county I've ever been in Maryland or Virginia, there's always a rolling road, and it's a straight line down to the river, so they can put these barrels on barges or the bateau, flat-bottom boats, and then take it off to market. So because it was pressed, it was actually a year's worth of work to get it into the hogshead because you had to dry it, and there's some fermentation that goes on. They would flavor it with like licorice or things to add flavor. The other aspect of this is that when you were to sell your tobacco, like Jefferson, he would be communicating to the sellers in England, and then they'd say, "Oh yeah, your barrel is worth like $500 this year, each hogshead." And so he'd send it over. Of course, a year later he's sending it, and then it's on the boat for a few months, and then it gets there, and then by the time it gets sold and communicates back to him, they said, "Oh, well, by the way, it really only sold for $300, but that's okay, you only owe us $200 that you've already spent." So it was a continuous cycle of You know, and so what farmers would do because of this system is they would put debris inside the barrel because nobody checked. They would pry the lid off and look at the first 2 leaves, and then inside would be like old boots or a couple of tools, something to weigh it down with. And so eventually there was a lot of changes in laws and so forth. Farmers always got around them, but eventually it became to the single leaf system with the tobacco auctions that you've probably all heard about. You know, you have these hands of tobacco, and then the people, you have them stacked so that I think the good part of the leaf sticks out. The auctioneer would pull out one, look at it, and then assess the value of it and give you the price. And that was like a French system it was to regulate the whole industry. So it's a pretty fascinating story. Oh, and the other thing is the tobacco that we grow is Arabica, which is from the slave trade. It originated in Suriname, where there's a huge story about Arabica the slave, in case you want to research that. It came up with John Rolfe to Virginia, or it actually went to Europe and then back to Virginia. And so it's still, the original is still grown in Varina, Virginia, where we were able to get seeds from Tennessee for that tobacco. And we also grow a burley, which is a air-dried tobacco. With a kind of drying where you do with heat was developed later on after Jefferson's lifetime. So the curing process was really what you see there, just hanging it from the rafters. Finding Jefferson's vegetables, I was trying to explain, I have this big list, and I try to find them by reading about them. And so I was reading about the white beet one day because, of course, we were growing those nice white fleshy roots for white beet because he gets white beets on his list. And so I'm reading, this is Charles McIntosh's book of the Garden, and I'm reading about the white or Sicilian beet. And if you start reading that, it says it belongs to the beet family, la la la, and then it said cultivated entirely for its leaves, whereas the red beet is grown for the roots. And I'm thinking, what is he talking about? And so as you go on, it says leaves are boiled like spinach and put into soup. The midrib and stalks, which are separated from the lamina of the leaf, are stewed and eaten like asparagus under the name of chard. And so, holy mackerel, all of us on staff had wanted Swiss chard in the garden forever. and suddenly, here we can have Swiss chard. And then, so we've been growing the white kind, although we call it white beet, of course. And I was reading Jard's Herbal, and actually he had all of the colorful chards too. It was an anomaly in his garden, and he had gotten seeds from a friend, and they grew the pink and the red and everything else. So imagine that Jefferson would have had the colorful ones too. If we can find some reference to it, it'd be great. But you know, white beet was white beet, whether it was red, pink, yellow, or any other color. So fascinating. And then here's another mystery story was the turnip cabbage, which he talks about in a letter. Actually, William McClure sends him seeds for the turnip cabbage, and he's calling it winter food for the cattle. And so I'm looking through books, and then John Parkinson, back in 1629, he has the turnip cabbage right there. And if you realize it's kohlrabi that they're talking about, because kovola rapa is the same, it means cabbage, turnip, and then kohlrabi is kind of like a similar word to kohlrabi. And so eventually the words all change. So what's really hard in vegetables is to figure out what the common names really mean, and so how they evolve. And the botanical names really aren't going to help us much because they're pretty much the same family. So anyway, we do grow kohlrabis, and he probably had both colors at the time. And then peas, everyone talks about Jefferson and the peas, how he loved peas. He had 22 kinds of peas. I was trying to determine what pea he had that was called Ledman's dwarf pea. And apparently there's 3 sort of groups of peas. The wrinkled peas, which when you shell them out, they're delicious. If you save them for soup, they're real hard to get the shell off of them. So they're just saved as eating peas, as shelling peas. You have smooth peas like the marrowfat pea, which is the kind you can put under rollers to get that shell off and make a nice pea soup from it. And then you have the edible podded peas, which means there's no fibers in the pod, so you don't have to worry about shelling and you can eat the whole thing. So Jefferson, he had 24 square garden, and the first 4 squares in 1813 were Ledman's dwarf pea. And so I was concerned, what kind of pea was this? So I went through all this work of reading the vegetables of New York, and when they are examining all the peas and comparing notes, which ones are the same. And so guess which one it turns out that Jefferson is growing 4 squares of, which is 1/4 of his 2-acre garden. What do you think? Or 1/6 of his 2-acre garden. It was the edible potted pea. And so I was amazed because that's a lot of peas all at once. And so a visitor came by and said, well, he had an ice house. Maybe he's just storing them in the ice house to keep them longer. or maybe he just loved this kind of pea. Maybe he's staggering the plantings enough. I don't know. But that's pretty fascinating. Of course, he did grow all these other kinds of peas, 22 kinds. He also planted the warded cymling. This is another quest of mine, to find a warded cymling squash. Cymling is a patty pan squash. We've grown the white kind forever. And then finally this year I found a warded cymling that actually had the warts. It's an old French variety. And so I'm quite excited to see if there's any taste difference or whatever, but it is more attractive. And then eggplants. Jefferson grew eggplants, which is pretty unusual for his time. He started growing them really early, like 1793 he mentions them. But they probably came from the slave trade, and when his niece, Mary Randolph, sauteed them with, she breaded and fried them, she felt they would taste like soft crabs. Like I told you, McMahon still lists them as ornamentals in the 1800s. So the Texas bird pepper is a really fascinating plant. He got this from Texas in 1814 from Samuel Brown. Jefferson is talking about peppers to be a stimulant if you have intestinal disorders, and I think Jefferson really suffered a lot from these things, and that's why he suggested that the vegetable is a condiment, the meat is condiment to the vegetable, because he was constantly eating vegetables and these pepper solutions and things like this to kind of stimulate his system. So the Texas bird pepper is extremely small, and it's eaten by birds, so we actually harvest it before the birds or the deer eat it. And I understand in Texas, when the birds eat this, their flesh, like a wild turkey's flesh, becomes infused with that hotness. And so if you catch a wild turkey that's eaten Texas bird peppers, you know it's already marinated. So now here's the Secale. We have a lot of visitors ask about Secale. They haven't seen it before, and it's a coastal cabbage plant. It's a perennial cabbage, and it grows each year from the shoots that come out from the root. And so because on the beach, it's a beach full of gravel, the beach would cover the plants up and effectively blanch them. The culture of the Secale is to cover it with a clay pot, which you see there, and to make those buds come up in the dark and make these tall leaves that are really sweet and juicy. And it sort of tastes like asparagus, which Jefferson's, wanted everything to taste like asparagus. So you could put a lot of butter on it. And the little flowers are gorgeous. They look like a little cartoon. And then the seed pods come out round, one seed per pod. And of course, being on the beach, they have a nice membrane over them that's like a floating capsule. And so the big heads of seeds will float around the beach like on tumbleweeds. So when we try to propagate this from seeds and from cuttings, the seeds are, well, apparently after a few months, they're really not viable any longer. So it's a difficult thing to propagate it from seed. But the cuttings, you take an inch root and just, it'll root readily and make new plants. Jefferson at one time had 500 of these in the fall, and another 600 in the spring, and I'm thinking 1,000 Secale plants. What are you doing with all this? And so what they would do is, because it's so easily forced, they would take a dozen in the house at a time, like in his wine cellar, and force the leaves and have a fresh vegetable all winter long. Pretty cool. Okay, now there's some tools of Jefferson that you might be interested in, so I brought some along. And one thing is his seed collection. I have the little bottle of sesame seeds here, which of course are called Benny back then. He would just store his seeds in little bottles, and he had a whole case that would be taken down into the garden. Today we actually produce seeds and put them in jars, so we get them really dry, and we put them in a refrigerator or wherever. But his techniques maybe were not all that great for saving seeds. His gardener saved seeds every year, and he would list what was saved. The other really cool thing is Jefferson kept a notebook. He would carry this in his pocket. It's an ivory notebook. So this is made like from piano keys. It's something you can write a little bit of with pencil on it, and you can erase that. So he would have this like in his waistcoat pocket, be able to note what's going on in the garden, and then transcribe it later. So that's pretty cool. So, and then of course he had a plow, and we have that kind of a plow today. We have some other interesting tools here. So this is a mechanism that Jefferson used for determining a schedule for planting, and it's a thimble. He had an enslaved worker working for him. So how can you communicate what you want to do? He took things that were really easy. So here's a thimble, and he would fill it with lettuce seed every Monday. He said, plant one thimble of lettuce seed every Monday from February through September. And so and then he would record whether it failed or was successful. And so not only did he have a succession crop every week's lettuce, he also could know when to stop planting and when to start planting again. And by the end of his lifetime, he's done this with so many plants that he knows the best schedule to plant in. And he publishes a schedule. And so in February, he's growing the lettuce, the spinach, the carrots, and that's what we do today. We start in February. He had started his gardens in May when he first started out, and by May in Virginia, it's way too hot. If you don't have your spring crops finished off by June, you're too late. So we start all the seeds in February, and we transplant all the cabbages and things out in March. This year, we had snow in March, so we were very much behind. It was chaotic. And so here's the planting plan. He had his journal. He told us where he put things. Here's 1813 with the where, the when, what failed, what didn't fail. And so what we do is I make a schedule. I kind of compare notes for where he had things and what can we do, because I really want to imitate his garden and his plans, but like I told you, the sesame around the carrots was like a real disaster. So, and then here's a little inset there of what his calendar looks like. So March 1st, he's putting in peas again. He's got potatoes, nasturtiums, garlic, leeks, onions, and so forth. And so that's what we do today. If we don't adhere to a really early schedule, we're just lost. And so then also in August or so, we'll start with the fall planting, because once we finish with the spring, the late spring, the early summer, then we have late summer, and then we have early fall and late fall. So that's our 6 planting schedules. So then we have some other interesting tools. And if Jefferson, of course, was coming out of the Roman era to plant, and we have some interesting things. They had axes, pruning knives, all of these great tools persist. And so we have I brought a little dibble. Some people have seen this before. A dibble stick is really great when you're transplanting. If you've seen this, we pop it in the ground. And then a compass and a string line. All of our rows are put together with a string line like you see. And measuring sticks, we measure everything out. And they just, good tool works forever. The thumb pot is a really lovely thing for sprinkling water. And then we have a lot of tools, of course, that Jefferson didn't have. And so we have a plow, fortunately, and broad forks if we really need to use that. And then we have dogs. We have to chase the deer. We have 4 dogs we let out every night. And we use plant skid repellent, and we use other things, lights and so forth. Do they work? I think you need everything that you can use. And they keep switching around, keep moving the lights, and keep changing up the repellents. We used liquid fence at one time, and now the deer know to eat garlic and peppers. And I was telling someone that, yeah, of course, and they'll eat it. And so we have the dogs are picked up in the morning around 7 in the golf cart, and at one point the deer knew the sound of the golf cart, and they would wait till the dogs left, and they'd run through like lawnmowers and just clean it out. Yeah. So we edged the garden with the compass. I have this beautiful intern that just did the whole garden for me, a beautiful edging. And then here's looking down the garden bed. In the border, we have like 10-foot areas of each kind of plant that we do. And then looking the other way, we have tomatoes on the left. We're doing some comparative tomatoes this year. We also lay out the rows. This is in February. We usually have a drought in February, so it's really dry. And so we just we plant everything and hope for rain, because the irrigation isn't turned on at that time. And then to hold the moisture in the ground, we lay boards over the rows, and that's a really cool technique. And we also have the seeds are pretty far down.
What do you lay over it?
Boards or poles. If you water your seeds in and then put the board on top, it keeps that fluctuating temperature from being there, and also keeps the moisture inside. And I like round ones so that if it does rain, the water will go around the pole and drop into where the seed is. And we also plant in a quincunx, because it gives the maximum space for plants. And I noticed the Wethersfield onions in the diversity garden are planted this way, where you have a row and then spaced plants, like on the left side, and then the next row in, it's spaced in between each of those. And eventually, all of your rows line up on a diagonal or horizontal and vertical. And so quincunx was from the Emperor Quintilian in Rome. Here, so you can see kind of like the diagonals that develop. And this is the early cabbages and kales from quite some time ago. And we also weave a lot of twig lattices to support things by just overlapping sticks, and they weave together for peas and so forth. We harvest a lot of lettuce seeds. We plant their lettuce to bloom at different times of the spring. And we cut the lettuce, and then we also harvest about 28 kinds of seeds to sell through our shop. And each one is measured out with a little, either by hand in counting or with a little spoon. We now have climate-controlled seed storage because of a curatorial area that was, a tree grew through it, so the curators said we don't want it any longer, so we got it fixed, and we have these cabinets for storage, and we use plastic jars because we had a lot of problems with glass. Jefferson grew a lot of yummy varieties of melons, and so we try to grow all those things. Here's the cymlings, again, the little bug problem. And then after the archaeology, this is the geothermal system going into the garden. You can see that they have taken like a third of the garden. We have this, if you notice the soil is red. We have red clay soil. And the construction crew was saying this is such great soil to dig in. You can get 98% compaction. So we have our work cut out for us. So that's the end of my talk. If you have any questions, it would be wonderful to answer them.